Hello, and welcome back to What's Your Ability, a podcast where we discuss disability related issues. Today, we're going to be looking at disability diagnosis and the impact it can have on education for primary school age children. We're going to look at it through a biological conceptual lens, and I'll explain what that means in a little bit. But for now, I think a good place to start is with the question, what is a disability? The Australian Bureau of Statistics defines it as any limitation, restriction, or impairment which restricts everyday activities and has lasted or is likely to last for at least 6 months. The ABS also reports that in 2018, the census information showed that there were 4.4 million Australians living with a disability. That was 17.7% of the population that year. In the same census, it was discovered that of that 4.4 million people, approximately 357,000 were children under the age of 15. And if we drill down even further, only 58,000 of those were in the age group of 0 to 4 years. That means that that's how many children were starting school already with a diagnosed disability. It makes me wonder how many are starting school undiagnosed and whether both of these will be getting the support they require. Now, I mentioned in the beginning how we're going to be looking at this topic through a biological conceptual lens. So I figure I better explain what this means for anyone that isn't aware. Well, if we first consider the biological factors of our lives, we start to think about things like genetics and hormones, nutritional levels, brain chemistry, and even characteristics such as gender. All of these components have an impact on our health and development. And when we look at a certain issue with a biological conceptual lens, we're looking at it with all of this in mind. So, with that said, the biological factors that I just mentioned are all important throughout our lives, but they are most crucial in the early years of development, in particular those children at primary school. This is where it can become quite apparent that a child might be experiencing some kind of difficulties or delays. You would hope this would lead to a formal diagnosis, but it isn't always the case, unfortunately. Let's now look at this from two different perspectives. The first would be the perspective of a child that is born with a permanent disability, for example, Down syndrome or cerebral palsy. The second perspective would be of a child that is later diagnosed with a disability, such as autism spectrum disorder or ADHD. One received an earlier diagnosis than the other. So how has that impacted their health and development? And can we even compare the two? Or is it apples and oranges, as they say? Either way, I think the most important thing here is the education that both children receive. Of course, early diagnosis is going to lead to early intervention, but if that isn't attainable, then that's where the education provider can play a big part in supporting the child. Diagnosis or not, it's crucial for a child with a disability, or any child for that matter, to have a supportive, understanding, and respectful environment to learn in. In fact, Article 26 of the United Nations Human Rights Act states that everyone has the right to an education, and that education shall be directed to the full development of the human personality. So basically, every human with a disability or without has a right to an education that is best suited to them. And that brings me to my next point about how a less suitable educational setting can have a negative impact on a child's health and development. For example, a child that might be struggling at school could then struggle to sleep at night because they're worrying about school. They might lose their appetite because of how stressed they are. And then without proper nutrition and sleep, they start to fall even further behind. We can only imagine the future impacts this might have on an individual if not addressed early on. Things such as homelessness, poverty, or even suicide. Now, I know it seems quite drastic to mention these, but it's important to call out what the lack of a suitable education could lead to for some people. The severity of this topic is real. According to UNESCO, some of the challenges that educators face are the identification of students with disabilities, the lack of training for teachers, the lack of resources, poorly adapted school facilities and learning materials, and the assessment of the learning outcomes of students with disabilities. Unfortunately, it's always the student that suffers. It's their health and development that is potentially impacted by this. I'm sure you're now wondering how we combat this. Well, the Australian Institute of Teaching and School Leadership outlines a personalised learning approach that involves consulting and collaborating with the student and/or caregivers, assessing and identifying the needs of the student, providing reasonable adjustments to address the identified needs, and monitoring and reviewing the impact of those adjustments. I think it's safe to say that even without a formal diagnosis of a disability, the responsibility still lies with the education provider to make the necessary adjustments to guarantee the student is receiving the highest quality of education suited to them. This helps to make sure that their disability or learning difficulties have less of a negative impact on their overall health and development. We're almost out of time, but I just want to lastly mention that Ewing mentions how we need to steer clear of the medical model, which characterises children's disabilities or learning difficulties as deficiencies. It highlights their weaknesses rather than their strengths. This can lead to lack of motivation, low self esteem, withdrawal, and all of these things can have negative impacts on their overall health and development. As Carol Dweck has pointed out, even just a simple change of language from the word fail to not yet puts a much more positive spin on things. It's not up to the students to change, it's up to the education to change. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for today. I hope you've enjoyed this episode and please tune in again next week. I'm Kristen Lang, thanks for listening.